I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So we have Dr. Mark Friedl, who's visiting us from Boston University. So Dr. Friedl, oh, I've got to stay over here, sorry. Dr. Friedl is an environmental scientist specializing in biophysical remote sensing of the Earth's land areas. Since 1993, he's been a faculty member at Boston University, where he leads the Land Cover and Surface Climate Research Group. He is also a member of NASA's MODIS, SUMI, VRS, multi-source land imaging science teams, and associate member of the USGS's Landsat 8 science team. A core focus of his research is statistical modeling and data analytics for large spatio-temporal data sets that integrate multispectral imagery with other sources of multi-temporal geospatial data. In 2016, he co-founded Tellus Labs, a technology company focused on expanding the use and utility of remote sensing in natural resource management. So if you please help me welcoming Dr. Mark Friedl to the stage. That'd be good.
We're good?
All right.
Great.
Have fun.
Thanks, Chris. Let me just start by thanking Chris and Claudio and the University of Wisconsin for inviting me. It's nice to be here. I've been in Madison once before to visit the university, and candidly, it was a pretty important point in my career and was quite influential. I feel like I benefited enormously from the experience, and so I was thrilled to be back. And I guess the other thing is, I think it's going to be the first and only time in my life that I'll ever see Chris Kucharik in a suit. So usually it's muddy boots and a beer in one hand and a guitar in the other. So, if you notice the agenda, I changed the title. I got a little guidance to try and be a little bit general. I may have taken that a little bit too far, but what I want to try and give you is kind of a top-level view of some perspectives based on, I've been in this business longer than I care to admit. I'm getting a little long in the tooth. Claudio, you showed that slide of that Fortran punch card that your mother used. I used those punch cards my freshman year in college learning Fortran, so either I'm old or your mother is very young, one of the two, right? So what I want to try and do is kind of give you an overview and just talk about this notion of photons to food. And I think in the remote sensing context, it's really important because obviously photons, photosynthetically active radiation, is what drives crop development and growth in many ways, and it's also what we're measuring from a remote sensing perspective. So just to give you a little bit of motivation here, I come at this from a couple of different points, and it's interesting putting these slides together, realizing how many touch points there are with the University of Wisconsin here, and what a really enormously influential community there is throughout remote sensing and agriculture and environmental sciences in general. So just starting out with a slide from Ndvi Ramankutty, a PhD from Wisconsin, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, something like that. Longer than that, okay. Time flies when you get old. But it's kind of a striking graphic to me. I think you guys can see red are pastures, green are croplands. But when a lot of people talk about global change science, they're talking about climate change. And one of the things that John Foley and his group, and Chris came out of that group, that really struck me back in the day is, if you want to think about transformation of the planet, climate change is one thing, but agriculture is far and away the larger force on the planet in terms of its impact on land areas. So it's outside of the tropical forests, the deserts, and the ice sheets. We've just transformed the entire planet for our use. So the way I think about it is that these large-scale agricultural issues and the role of remote sensing, there's kind of two things. First of all is that agriculture just has this enormous impact on the planet, and we need to be thinking about ways about how to manage this. This is some graphics from from the Wall Street Journal article that showed up just this week showing the change in basically productivity in the U.S. Over time in soybeans, corn, wheat, where in 1985 the U.S. was clearly the world leader in agriculture and production, not so much anymore. And that has come at the expense of land, and that expensive land has these really substantial implications. So here's a MODIS image. I'm not sure how well it comes out. This is in Brazil. This is Mato Grosso down here. Here's the Xingu Basin. Here's Rondônia up here. And it's just an enormous impact on all dimensions of the environment, from water resources to land resources to nutrient cycles, you name it. Agriculture is a force of nature on the planet. And then the second thing is societal. All right, which is what, current projections are that we're at over 7 billion, we're going to 10 billion people on the planet. Part of that is we have developing nations. When economies change, diets change, and diets change requires more food to feed them. Right, so current estimates are we need to increase food production by 70 to 100% on the planet. And the key caveat there is with limited land, right? We're using it all right now, unless we want to take down the entire tropical forests, what we've got. So we have to increase yields, right? And we have to do that in an era of climate change where water is getting increasingly scarce. So it's a balancing act. We have to figure out how to do it. This is a slide from a paper that John Foley and, I don't know, Chris, you might have been on that paper too, I can't remember, a whole bunch of people, from Nature in 2011. And I'm never entirely sure that I understand some of John's graphics, but I think what he's trying to say here, okay, good. I think, is that, this is our target for, the circle here is target for 2015, and he's just trying to show the balance between sort of environmental impacts versus where we are with respect to food production, and where we need to be is down here where we're generating more food with less impact, with less impact, all right? And so from my perspective, as a remote sensing scientist, what we're trying to do is think about ways that remote sensing, observations of the planet, can inform those types of decisions. All right, and so, what is the role here? Well, there's a couple of things. One is remote sensing. It does provide an archive of change in the planet during a period where we've gone from roughly 3 billion to 7 billion people on the planet. All right, so there's a sort of rich archive of information there related to how we're transforming the planet, how agriculture is changing, where it's changing, and so on. And it also provides direct observations in near real time of where things are happening and how they're changing. Okay, so what I'd like to try to do today, here's a beautiful artist rendering of the Landsat 8 satellite. You can see, we do this a lot in these artist renderings. There's no clouds over the continent, right? Makes it look nicer. But that's actually kind of an important aspect that I'm going to touch on. But what I'm going to try and do today, I can't actually read my slides there, is give you, so I hope this is, for those of you that know some remote sensing, you may have to bear with me a little bit. I just want to lay the groundwork in terms of what we're actually doing, what we're measuring when we talk about remote sensing in very, very basic terms, and we'll try and do that pretty quickly. I want to give you kind of a random walk of the types of agricultural information we extract from remote sensing. I want to talk about the current, what I call this kind of ecosystem, and it's really an era of very rapid change between what's happening in the research sector versus the private sector. And then I want to finish up with some thoughts about technology trends and what we need to be thinking about, particularly in the context of some of the things that Claudio's talked about in terms of what's the role of universities versus a private sector, where are the sort of, at least the gaps, the disconnects that I see. All right, so let's start out with remote sensing. All right, so we've already established that I'm old, or I'm getting there, right? I'm a little long in the tooth. So in my youth, what I thought of as remote sensing was kind of this, right? Which is that Mr. Spock would stare into this box, and this light would shine on his face, and he'd be able to tell you what the composition of the atmosphere was, how many humans, how many ants, how many males, how many females. He could tell everything, right? And we're not quite there yet, but I think we're making it's pretty remarkable progress if you look at the sort of mosaic of what remote sensing is doing these days. And so, at a very, very basic level, what are we doing here? We're measuring electromagnetic radiation that's being reflected or emitted by the planet, and we're trying to infer properties. All right, so what we see with our eyes is the solar spectrum, which is a fairly narrow range in the electromagnetic spectrum. But there's all these other wavelengths out there, and the way that radiation is emitted or is scattered or reflected by plants, crops, is largely a function of the structure and properties of those materials. All right, so what we basically have is, from a satellite remote sensing perspective, and one of the big transitions, I think Claudio alluded to it, I think Chris as well, is we're moving away from space-based platforms to lower altitude orbits. But traditionally what we've got is a satellite orbiting the planet, collecting observations in all these different wavelengths, which gives us a much richer set of information relative to what the human eye can see. All right, so for example, just going to show a quick movie here. Here's the Landsat 8 sensor, and basically what we've got is we've got an instrument that's circling in what we call a near polar orbit. So it's circling the poles, and the Earth is orbiting underneath. In the case of Landsat, the sort of descending orbit is illuminated. The ascending orbit is at night. There's a swath of about 185 kilometers in which those data are being collected. And so as the Earth moves under it, we're collecting observations. All right, and then this proceeds over the course of roughly 16 days. Hopefully this speeds up a little bit because I'm a little bit ahead of it. So what we get is a cycle in which we're able to see and cover the entire Earth through this multispectral instrument. Slowing down, my video slowed down here, at a 16-day cycle. All right, so we can basically image the entire Earth repeatedly, and that time dimension is really, really important. Okay, so that's Landsat, and that's traditionally, so when I was in graduate school, most people with remote sensing, they had maybe one, they were lucky they had one Landsat image, and they wrote an entire dissertation on that. Now what we've got, so I'm going to show you now, is the constellation that NASA is currently flying. And it's literally an embarrassment of riches. I mean, this is, in my world, it's just amazing. There's so many assets in space, and they're observing not just the land, it's oceans, it's cryosphere, it's clouds. There's a big group here at University of Wisconsin does all this stuff. But basically, and this is just NASA, it's a flood of data of all sorts of different types and attributes. All right, so I don't even know what the number is right now, but there's roughly, 17 platforms up there, some of them with multiple instruments on them, in different orbits, with different spatial resolutions, capturing data at different timescales. Oh, and look, they even add, this is the Discover mission. Do you guys know Discover? That's one of the missions that the Trump administration is talking about canceling. So we'll just move on from there. Okay, so what are we doing here? All right, at the broadest scales, what we've got is this incredibly diverse and complex mosaic of observations collected in what we call active versus passive. So passive is you're measuring emitted radiation or reflected radiation, or there's active sensors as well, where we're propagating LiDAR and radar, propagating radiation towards the Earth, observing its scattering properties in different electromagnetic parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, which gives us different information. We've got different spatial resolutions. Currently, the highest available is about 30 centimeters all the way up to tens of kilometers. Different temporal resolutions from continuous. We've got geostationary satellites. We basically put satellites in orbit at an altitude such that their angular rotation is the same as that of the Earth, so they say stationary. versus, a couple of weeks. And finally, these different sort of more sort of detailed characterizations about how fine the spectral measurements are and at what sort of resolution precision there. So what this involves, in just crude terms, is a lot of trade-offs in terms of how you analyze the data and how you collect the data. So traditionally, and again, these are things that are all changing, one of the big trade-offs is this notion of spatial resolution versus repeat frequency. All right, and this is one of the big challenges, particularly, for example, with precision agriculture. If you're going to use remote sensing, you want high spatial resolution, but you don't want an image of once every 2 years. And there may be clouds in the way on that one day when there's the overpass. So that doesn't help you at all, right? So there are these challenges here. So I'd just like to sort of illustrate some of these things, how this works. So for example, here's MODIS, which has now become one of the great dames of remote sensing. So, people used to think it was the greatest thing ever. Now it's kind of old news, but it's still a beautiful instrument. It's been up there for one of them's been up there for 17 years now. It captures data in the visible, infrared, and SWIR at about 500 meter spatial resolution with these 2,300 kilometer swaths, right? So what that allows us to do is capture data at coarse resolution on a near daily basis, right? And so if you watch this time sequence, you can actually see those mid-latitude wave cyclones tracking along in the South Polar Ocean and at high latitudes as well. The other thing, just I would point out while you're looking at this, that you should note is the most, or for me, one of the most striking features when you look at this kind of imagery is clouds, right? The Earth is a cloudy place. And so I think, in the current context, a lot of people don't understand the challenges involved with identifying, removing, creating clean data. Because we don't, to us, clouds are noise. We get rid of them, right? So we'll come back to that later. So we go from 500 meter, sort of near daily coverage to Landsat and Sentinel-2, which is a Landsat-like instrument that the European Space Agency is doing. So from there, we go from 30 meters, about 185 kilometer swath every 16 days. Here's Sentinel, where we're going down to 10 and 20 meters. They've got a bigger swath on that every 10 days. And so there's this trade-off between how big of an area you can cover versus how frequent. And then lastly, here's an image that I stole from Digital Globe, which is a commercial remote sensing. They've got the WorldView 2 satellite, roughly 31 centimeters. Anyone know what this image is of? Anyone guess? Tulips in Netherlands, yeah. Which, from a precision ag perspective, this is kind of what you want, right? 31 centimeters, that allows you to get fine-grained information at the field level. But the tasking, I think, if I've got the numbers right, I think they collect about 4 million square kilometers a day, which sounds like a lot, but if my algebra is correct, that's about 2% of the Earth's surface, right? So in terms of how you use this, in terms of agriculture, where you want high frequency, repeat, high resolution, it's a mix. All right, so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about how we got here. It's interesting because, I work in I do remote sensing, and I also do a little bit in agriculture, and I also do a certain amount of sort of the surface climate world. And it's one of the things that's sort of interesting parallels to me in terms of this work is there's a definite sort of commonality between the remote sensing field and land surface climate modeling, in that a lot of it comes from agriculture. If you look at a lot of the terrestrial ecosystem models that are out there, a lot of it came from that very basic work in agrometeorology. Same with remote sensing. So the early days of the remote sensing program were literally focused on agriculture. All right, in part motivated by the fact that the US government wanted to know what the wheat yields were going to be in the Soviet Union in advance of their announcement, which was, basically state secrets and would disrupt things like commodity markets. So it all started with these large-scale field experiments, largely driven by places like Purdue University, Lacey, AgriStars, Corn Blight Watch experiment, which is an airborne experiment, which was kind of proof of concept. And so based on that, there was a lot of promises made. So I like to quote one of my graduate mentors, a guy named David Simonet, who was kind of a tough-as-nails Aussie, did not mince his words, intimidated the hell out of a lot of graduate students. But he once said to me was the key to success is to underpromise and overproduce. And it always stuck with me. Not that I've ever succeeded, but it's good to keep in mind, right? And so here's an example of one of the challenges with remote sensing. All right, so this is an article that was in Science Magazine by McDonald et al., Global Crop Forecasting. And that was published in May of 1980. All right, 37 years ago now, nearly. Right, so the question is, have we actually made much progress? I would say yes, but it's taken a hell of a long time. Here's something that showed up as I was cleaning my office a little while ago from a trade magazine called Imaging Notes, Precision Farming, the view from above, and the idea was that remote sensing had arrived as a tool in precision ag, and that was published in 1998. All right, so 20 years ago. And then here we are in 2017, and I stole this from the Digital Globe website. I apologize this didn't come out, but basically what they're showing is that you can see your yield grow, and here's vigorous growth, and here's some problems over here. And the question is, has this changed? Has remote sensing fulfilled this promise of sort of providing useful, timely information to the agricultural community beyond some pretty pictures? Okay, so to answer that question, I want to talk a little bit about how we do this. The answer is yes and no. What we're measuring and how those measurements, the key here is turning measurements into information. Right? And so as I sort of alluded to before, there's a physical basis here, which is that we're trying to take photons, right, and turn those into information. And the physical basis, at least particularly in the reflective domain, is this very basic relationship between the way that plants, this is a spectral reflectance curve as a function of wavelength, interact with radiation. And so we see these very strong chlorophyll absorption features in the visible. We see strong reflective features associated with the internal structure of plants in the near infrared, and then we see these strong absorption bands associated with water out in the short wave in the middle infrared. And increasingly we're seeing features associated at narrow wavelengths with other features like lignin, nitrogen, and so on. And so the idea here is you want to try and exploit these types of properties to estimate properties of the vegetation. All right, so for example, here's an image of, I grabbed this quickly, this is a Landsat image over Phoenix in sort of natural color. We're just projecting in red, green, and blue. If we project that, if we use the near infrared, right, where we've got this high reflectance, vegetation jumps out, all right? And so we want to try and exploit this type of information to basically infer properties about plants. So I'm going to skip a large piece of the story here, which is really, really fundamental, all right? But it's maybe a little bit too nerdy and beyond the scope of you guys. But to go from those radiances at the top of the atmosphere to actually measuring things at the surface, converting pictures into measurements, there is an enormous amount of sophisticated work that goes on with things like screening clouds out of imagery, right? Which sounds like it should be totally easy, right? Google can figure out can identify cats in images. We can't figure out clouds? Clouds are remarkably complex and diverse, thin clouds, lower level clouds, upper clouds. So this is, there's a lot, and basically the space agencies are cleaning a lot of this stuff out for us these days, but it's far from perfect and it's a really hard problem. And then the second thing is, we're looking from space, we're looking through hundreds of kilometers of atmosphere, with moisture, with aerosols, with dust, with smoke, all that kind of stuff. And so creating clean imagery, I'm skipping 20 years of remote sensing research, just take it on faith. It's Far from an easy problem, and it's far from a solved problem. There's still a ways to go on this. But basically, what we need to get at is these measurements, and I think measurements is a key word, of surface reflectance, because that's a quantity we know how to work with that has biophysical meaning. All right, and so the way this is done, how do we extract information? There's two basic paradigms here. One is what I call biophysical remote sensing, where you've got some kind of a physical model of the way that the plants, and this is obviously highly sort of simplified, interact with radiation, where you talk about absorption, scattering, reflection, multiple scattering within the plant canopy. You turn that into some type of information. So this is a graph I stole from John Monteith's book. This is the fraction of absorbed PAR as a function of a ratio, spectral ratio of wavelengths. And based on the sort of our understanding of the radiative transfer in plant canopies, one of the things we can pull out are things like the amount of, if you know how much PAR is arriving at the surface, how much of that PAR is actually being absorbed by the plants, which drives photosynthesis, right? Things like that, LAI, which then goes into, anyone know, Chris knows this reference. Anyone else know this reference? I had to throw this in. Cupid model, which was John Norman, who was an enormous pioneer in this field, who, you know, and was one of the first guys to try and build these sort of process-based models that used inputs based on remote sensing, based on some physical understanding of the way the plant canopies interact with radiation. Sorry, Chris, I should have put agroibis, but you know, I had to. So that's one way. And in very general terms, we have these sort of biophysical models. And then the other way, which is really a parallel track and is big these days, is this what I call this image processing, pattern recognition, and machine learning kind of a model. Where in this case, here's two images across 2 steps in time. I forget where this is, I apologize. Where you can see they first applied computer vision approaches to do field delineation to identify the fields. And then they used support vector machines to actually do classification on the crop types based on some training data related to what the spectral features look like and the temporal profiles in the data. Okay, so very generally, 2 basic paradigms. And so what do you do with this? What do we do with this? You know, there's a lot of different applications here. I'm going to take you to what I call kind of a random walk through the types of things. And the idea here is I just want to give you an idea of the types, forms, and nature of the information that we get out of, or that people have used to get out of remote sensing. All right, so for example, here's some of our work at global scale. This is a map of croplands globally that we estimate from remote sensing. And so how do we do that? We take spectral information from this instrument, called MODIS. We combine that with the temporal information because the phenology of crops, the seasonality of crops is indicative information. And we pump that through a supervised machine learning algorithm with a little bit of Bayesian statistics on top to give us a map of the global extent of crops worldwide. And we do that on an annual basis. All right? And the other thing is I'm going to try and sort of go to increasing levels of refinedness here. So crop area is obviously the easiest thing. Crop type is something that's been mapped for years. Here's an example, the Cropland data layer, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is produced by the National Agricultural Statistics Survey. In fact, basically one guy, Dave Johnson, sitting in an office by himself. It's pretty impressive what he does. And what he does is he takes some of the NAS survey data, he combines that with multi-temporal, mostly Landsat data. They've used other sources over the years to map on an annual basis crop types and crop areas within the United States at 30-meter spatial resolution. It's pretty impressive. Okay. Taking that one step further, there's a big push right now. ESA, the European Space Agency, is really emerging in the last few years as a driving force in global remote sensing and global remote sensing technology. They've got these Sentinel series of satellites that I'll talk about later. But here's an example of, in Bohemia, this was early results of crop type. You can't really see these. These are just sort of crude crop types. And leaf area. And the other thing I should say is this is all done retrospectively at the end of the season. This is done in season. So they're pushing towards operational mapping of crop type and things like leaf area index over the course of the growing season from these time series of satellite images. Yield modeling. This is something that I've worked on a little bit and continue to work on. What I'm showing you here, some work I did with a master's student a few years ago, Doug Bolton, who's now up at UBC. He worked on agriculture for me and decided he wanted to become a forester, maybe not a strong endorsement on my supervisory skills, but in any case, we did this paper where we basically tried to use time series of MODIS data and extract both the spectral information and the phenological information as a basis for trying to forecast in-season crop yield. And it worked pretty well. At finer spatial scales, here's some work by Dave LaBelle. Some of you may know David out at Stanford. And what David's doing is he's using the series model, series maize, series soy, tuning it to data and then trying to use Landsat data to actually map the spatial distribution of crop yields at that 30-meter spatial resolution from Landsat. All right? So now we're starting to get close to the types of information that's relevant at the field scale for management and precision ag. What else? We can look at multi-cropping and phenology, crop phenology from space. This graphic is not showing up too well, but basically here's some work I did with a colleague at BU mapping the intensity of cropping in Asia. That really doesn't come out very well, based on time series. Right? We get this high density of observations from instruments like MODIS. All right, and you can see over here, this is the Asian monsoon. It's a bit of a problem. We get lots of dropouts, but it's still enough to actually capture that seasonality where we can actually capture both the timing, sort of the growth cycles and the number of growth cycles, which leads us to be able to ask questions related to intensification in place through multi-cropping in places like Asia where food supply is a huge issue. Ooh, this didn't come out well at all, sorry. And then taking the same type of idea, and now what we're trying to do is we're trying to move it down to Landsat scale. So here's a historical time series of Landsat, pretty tough at that 16-day repeat, but enough that you can sort of see, and you guys can see actually, here's all the noise in the data. Those blue lines is the original data, the red is after we apply a filter to it. This is a scene in Kansas, where you can see here's pasture lands and the croplands in the lower lying areas come out very clearly. And so we can map, I forget which is which. I think this is maximum Ndvi and this is the timing day of year, sorry you guys, on which we see emergence of live vegetation. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a little bit of Mutlu's work here. One of the things that we're trying to do a lot, Mutlu has sort of been leading the charge on this, is looking at things like irrigation. Water supply, 70% of water appropriated on the planet is used for agriculture. And we're moving into this era of climate change, limited water resources, and so understanding where irrigation is happening, how much water use is happening, is really, really essential information. Field delineation. Here's kind of a remarkable, you can't really see it too well. This is an image from North Dakota. This is work by David Roy and his group, where they've been mapping fields, delineating fields which is because then you can go from actually identify the field, then it becomes easier to identify the crops rather than doing it at a pixel level, where they apply these machine learning, computer vision algorithms to delineate the fields. They do a bunch of massaging, and you can see they get this really nice, well-defined characterization of the field boundaries. Pretty impressive. And this type of stuff is only going to get better as the higher resolution data starts to come online. Okay, and then I think this is my last one on this kind of random walk. Yet another University of Wisconsin graduate, Martha Anderson, working with the Landsat science team, where she's developed with fungal this sort of multi-scale approach to estimating water use. Okay, where we go from global scale using geostationary, continental scale using geostationary. I should also say, I haven't talked about this much, thermal data is one of the key inputs here. So Martha, in addition to using those sort of optical measurements, is also using thermal data because that's a key indicator of surface energy balance and by extension evapotranspiration. So she's built this model that goes from global to continental to regional to daily at the basin scale to the watershed, to the field scale, and at each level we're using airborne, she's using, I'm not using it, airborne, polar orbiting, Landsat, polar orbiting mode, geostationary, and so on. Really, really impressive. And this all came out of the early work she did with John Norman back in the day here at the University of Wisconsin. All right, so in the few minutes I have left, how am I doing for time? I got about 10 more minutes? 20 minutes? Okay.
You want to take questions?
Yeah, I'll leave a few for questions. So, so it means I don't have to rush through because I was a little bit worried I was going to have. So some emerging trends that I see. Whoops. So the first thing is, and I'm just going to touch on this, is this notion of refined spectral information. Okay, so one of them. I'll talk about this in a second, actually, but NASA is sort of shifting models a little bit away from, well, NASA's always claimed that it's a research organization, not an operational. So any satellites that flies, NASA will tell you, this is not a permanent thing, this is just experimental for research purposes. NOAA does operational, we do research, but, you know. And then we've got MODIS up there for 17 years now, so. But they are shifting this model towards these faster, cheaper, more experimental satellites. And one of the most interesting panels I've sat on in a long time was a panel looking at these venture class instruments. It's supposed to be faster and cheaper, experimental instruments. And it was remarkable, the technology that's being built around the country to measure all sorts of really, really interesting stuff. All right, so for example, one of the things that's emerged recently is this ability to measure solar-induced fluorescence, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, right? And so the idea here is that as part of the photosynthetic pathway, photon energy that's coming in gets re-emitted, it gets fluoresced at a different wavelength, very narrow wavelength. So it's a very, very difficult measurement, you require very narrow wavelengths, and it's very small fluxes. But remarkably, we now are starting to build instruments. One is in space, the Orbiting Carbon Observatory, which can actually measure this from space. And I think in the near future, we're going to have these types of instruments on aircraft. In fact, I know that JPL has one on aircraft now. And presumably, give it another 10 years, they'll be on UAVs. And so you can actually have this potential. I should say, in my community, everyone's very excited about SIF, right? That we're finally going to be able to measure photosynthesis in space. I guess I'm kind of old and get a little cynical. I can remember when MODIS was going to close the global carbon budget, right? So that hasn't happened. We'll see what happens with SIF because it's a very difficult measurement and the processes are complex, but it's also quite exciting. This notion that we can measure this fluorescence process coming off of leaves is really remarkable. And I would just point out, there was a really interesting paper that showed up in PNAS a couple years ago. If you look here, one of the highest solar-induced fluorescence regions on the planet is coming out of the Midwestern United States. So I don't know whether, yeah?
How come there's nothing on the oceans?
Because I'm not sure whether they're doing it over oceans, to be honest, and for this is just processed for land. But this article that showed up in PNAS actually compared the productivity of, let's say, Iowa with the Amazon basin, right? Similar amounts of carbon uptake. So we'll see if that holds up, but it gives you a sense of the types of things that, or maybe another way of saying it, it's pretty interesting that agriculture shows up in these measurements quite distinctly. Other things, there's lots of work surrounding a variance of this, the so-called PRI, the photochemical reflectance index, the CCI, the chlorophyll index, which are trying to use narrowband measurements to actually measure the sort of the photosynthetic capacity of leaves. All right, and so this is just a sampling of a few of things, but there's lots of developments these days, lots of activity around refined instruments, higher quality instruments, narrowband instruments that allow us to get at some of these things that we really care about, as opposed to, I'm sure many of you have heard of Ndvi, right? The Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is this sort of just general index of how green the surface is. All right, so moving forward. So that's one thing. Another new emerging trend I see is, and I sort of alluded to this, both new instruments and this just tsunami of data, right? We have no clue how to deal with this data. So here's a still version of that animation I showed you before, the sort of fleet of instruments. NASA is currently focusing on these lower cost experiments. We're still going to have MODIS until it runs out of fuel. There's the SUMI VIIRS and SUMI platforms that are going to be up there operationally. But in the future, there's going to be fewer instruments from NASA, more focused on specific experimental. One is EcoStress, which is a multispectral instrument with a thermal instrument, a paired multispectral thermal camera on it. And JEDI, the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, which is a spaceborne LiDAR. Both of those going on the space station. So you'll get different orbits from those than what we're used to, but probably some pretty interesting data that then can be prototyped and used and maybe launched on other platforms. The US GS is responsible for Landsat. They're going to continue currently in planning for Landsat 9 and Landsat 10. Yep.
What do you predict as far as, given the current political environment, the future for some of these instruments? Do you think they'll continue forward, or are we going to see?
Oh, I was hoping somebody wasn't going to ask me that. I don't know. I mean, I've been around long enough. The Bush administration was not great either, right? They were a little bit, they tried to take planet Earth out of NASA's mission statement. So we'll see. I mean, I guess, as I say, I've been around long enough to see these things come, things go. I've also been around long enough to know that there's a lot of inertia in DC, and I also know that, if you go to Goddard Space Flight Center, very few people actually work for the federal government. They work for the Raytheons of the world and the Northrop Grumman's, and those companies have a lot of political power as well. So it's not good news, right? It's just not good news. We're not going to see a $3 billion annual increase in NASA's Earth science budget during this administration. But I prefer to try to be a little bit optimistic. But together, I was just going to say, and Landsat could change in the coming years with the technology that's happening. Landsat is now old. The current Landsat is now old technology, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Together, it's very, very hard to know exactly. It's very hard to get these types of information out of it. How much data is in your archive? The closest I could get is that together, the USGS and NASA currently have about 20 petabytes of data, and it's growing by about roughly 3 petabytes a year. But don't quote me on that, please. But that's sort of ballpark. And the key point here is that this is just, it's an enormous archive of extremely high quality data, right? Which is in contrast to some of the other sources we can talk about in a minute. And then the other thing, après moi le déluge, right, is that the Europeans have jumped into this in a really big way. All right, so they've got this whole the Copernicus program has this Sentinel series. I apologize for the quality, this didn't come out. Sentinel 1 through 6. These are in suite. There's 2 Sentinel 1s in space right now. There's the second Sentinel 2 was just launched about a month ago. Sentinel 3 is up, and so on. So they've got this whole program through 2027 where they're going to be flying these satellites and collecting data. And just for reference, Sentinel 2 alone is 3 petabytes a year. All right, so it's a flood of data, a data NAMI. I hate this expression, but this is a term that people talk about. And for the ESA, the European Space Agency, unlike NASA, where all the data is online, you can access it, they're going to keep it online for about 3 months, and then they're going to archive it, because it's just too much. That's their management strategy right now. Maybe 6 months, I don't know. They change their story every week, so don't quote me on that either. Is this being recorded? I guess it is. So. All right. So that's another emerging trend. The space agencies are providing tons of high-quality data, buckets and buckets. And my thesis is it's being completely underexploited for a lot of applications. Another thing that's following on that is a data fusion. NASA has this expression. From missions to measurements, the notion being that the way that they built most of the science is centered on a single mission, MODIS, Landsat, Aster, right? The idea now is we need to take these data streams from all these diverse data sources and blend them together into something meaningful. So what I'm showing you here is an animation from a former colleague who was with me at BU, Josh Gray. He's now at North Carolina State, where he's basically using Kalman filtering. Some of you may be familiar with Kalman filtering. It's a very, very widely used technique to blend. I'll just show that again so you can actually daily coarse resolution imagery from MODIS with messy, less frequent data from Landsat. You can see there's this thing called the scanline corrector dropouts to produce wall-to-wall daily observations. All right, so that's one example. I think what we're going to be seeing in the future is a lot more applications of people taking not just optical measures, but optical with microwave, you name it. And also blending this with some of the, in the case of farming, with the in-field data. All right, I think this is going to be a huge growth area in the coming years. But I think both Claudio and Chris mentioned UAVs. Right? I was amused to find that there's actually a publication on the web called Drone Life, and maybe the readers of Drone Life need to get a life. But you know, this is the FAA has. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the sort of the emergence of UAVs. FAA has been challenging, but that is slowly but surely changing. And I saw one estimate that the UAV market in the United States, focused largely on agriculture, is going to be something like a $73 billion a year industry in the next 10 years. So this is coming. And so the question, and so here's an example from Bernie et al. From a few years ago where they flew some UAV and they backed out chlorophyll content. I think this is an olive grove and leaf area index. So this, in some ways, is really the future of precision ag from a remote sensing perspective. We'll see where it goes. It has to be viable, it has to be cost-effective, and it has to be useful, right? And I think that's one of the questions from a farmer's perspective, is this stuff useful? And then, yeah, my last emerging trend, and this is just off the top of my head, is that there's this just remarkable wave of commercialization that's happened. Silicon Valley and other places have suddenly discovered remote sensing. All right, and so, you know, I've been in this business over 20 years, and for most of that time, it's been the domain of space agencies and universities. Now we're in a world where, with a little bit of, you know, it's like Digital Globe, just bought by MDA, Airbus, and Demios. I think Demios may have been bought by one of these guys just a little while ago. But just for example, Digital Globe, I think about 60% of its revenue is from governments. i.e. DoD. Right. Now we're in a world where basically, I don't have my cell phone, but people like Planet Labs are basically taking the technology in your cell phone, putting them in space. Okay. So, and not only that, I mean, this just blows my mind. So Planet Labs, some of you guys may be familiar with this. They're kind of the 800-pound gorilla these days. But there's Astro Digital, I think they're in the Bay Area as well. Earthcast is in Vancouver. Black Sky is in Seattle. Black Sky, last I looked, is planning to, and a lot of these guys, these are all constellations, not single satellites. Planet Labs currently has about 100 CubeSats in space. So what they're doing is they're providing daily coverage of the planet at, they claim, 5-meter resolution. Okay. But it's a JPEG from space, right? That's a big distinction from what, for example, the space agencies are doing. Black Sky is putting a constellation up in a different orbit. And I think, I may have this wrong, they claim that they're going to be imaging the mid-latitudes of the planet 5 times a day. Okay? So there's Planetary Resources is a company in Seattle, GeoOptics, you know, it just every day there's a new company that somehow found $100 million to start flying satellites. So, I mean, there's this enormous sort of ecosystem that's growing around that. But the key here, not all, but most of these guys, is not science-grade data like we have from the space agencies. Landsat, for example, people don't like to talk about how much Landsat costs as an instrument, but it's extremely expensive, okay? Hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And it's the size of a minivan, right? But for that money and that size of, you just can't put the same technology on something that's the size of a shoebox. Pointing accuracy, radiometry, calibration, spectral range, right? As soon as you go past the near-infrared, detectors get much more expensive, which is why for right now, companies like Planet Labs, they don't go past the near-infrared. So it's a really, really important point. I mean, I think this is going to change rapidly, but in the short term, what we're getting is JPEGs from space as opposed to measurements from space. And I really don't want to be too harsh, because I think what these companies are doing is remarkable. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where they go over the years, but right now, for the types of things that I do, it's not quite that yet. And then going along with that is this sort of what I call new tech ecosystem of companies that are trying to take these data streams and turn them into information. And I'm guilty of a little of that myself. Okay, so where does this leave us? You know, can't read my own slide here. You know, I think coming back to John Foley's point, we need better information. We need better information for environmental management, and we need better information for crop management. Okay? You know, information, right now, a lot of what we do in remote sensing, I have a colleague at the University of New Hampshire that likes to say remote sensing is the art of illuminating the obvious, right? So it doesn't help anyone in Wisconsin for me to make a map of crop types of Wisconsin in December that says, oh, you grew corn over there, right? So what we need is we need to know where things are growing, how much they're growing, how healthy they are, all that kind of stuff, yields, insect infestations, in season, not after the fact, right? And how can we also blend in a sort of a data modeling kind of approach, forecast information in advance of when it's happening. So it's observations with forecast. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because I'm running out of time if we're going to have any time for questions. And then in terms of this is kind of my take-home point from a technology side. We've got massive data, massive amounts of data that's growing. We've got instrument technology that's growing rapidly. We've got this dynamic and growing both public and private sector, including UAVs. It's generating more data. We've got this enormous capacity for cloud compute that allows us to process large data sets. And we've got mature and continuously evolving machine learning technology, right? The issue, and I was trying to figure out a better graphic, I don't know, it was late last night, I couldn't do this, is that we've got the data and the technology, and there's this disconnect between somehow making this connection and getting that information out quickly and better. All right? And so the place that I come to is, this is from a guy, Drew Conway, who's a data scientist and then my last two slides, then I'll shut up, in New York, which, his data science Venn diagram has gotten a little bit of traction, which just says, the basic elements of data science are some hacking skills, some knowledge and statistics skills, and some substantive expertise, and you put the three of those guys together, and that's what data science is. You need all three of those elements. And that you put these two together, people like me who have a little bit of expertise and a little bit of hacking skills, and that's when you get yourself in trouble. Here's my version, right? In terms of remote sensing and agri-informatics from the sort of data processing side, we have expertise in image processing, spatial statistics, GIS. We have people that know some statistics, and we have people that know some remote sensing, agri-meteorology, and plant ecology. This is where Drew would traditionally put the danger zone. I actually put the danger zone here. What I see in the community is a lot of people, and somebody, whether it was Chris or Claudio mentioned this before. Oh, it was that art piece from Wired. There's this notion in the world that if you just throw data at computers, they will solve everything. Baloney. Right? You cannot solve the types of problems where we need people who understand how crops actually grow. We need people that understand the complexities of remote sensing, and we need people that understand. So this, to me, this is what we're lacking right now. And that this is what this type of a meeting needs to be about, is how, and we've been talking about this for years, this notion of interdisciplinary work. It's hard. I have tried and worked with some success and some dismal lack of success to work with, for example, computer scientists and statisticians. Some computer scientists say, just give me your data. Also, I'll take it from there. Never going to work. So I'll get off my soapbox, but really this is the take-home message for me. In order to make this work, you've got really complicated data, you've got really complicated physical, ecological processes, and you've got really complicated math and statistics, and somehow we have to find a way to put those together. That's how we'll get there. And right now, I'll just be honest, we're just not there, at least in my, we're getting there, but we're still a little bit too siloed. All right, so I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention, and I got left 3 minutes for questions.
Got time for one or two questions?
Yes?
You were talking, about these small satellites. My understanding is that with thousands of them going up in orbit, that space junk becomes a pretty serious problem for things like Landsat. And so when you talk about emerging trends, I just wonder if you envision emerging trends being working from higher orbits or dealing with these lower quality imagery and lower quality data from these smaller satellites that are kind of more disposable.
Right, so the question was, with all the stuff that's floating around the planet, how are we going to kind of manage it, and where's the future there? I know, for example, NASA has remarkably sophisticated tracking of all the stuff that's up there. And they actually occasionally will maneuver the satellites around. Depending on the acquisition strategy and the orbital properties and how, whether you're in a polar orbiting orbit or non-polar orbit, there's a lot of complications, a lot of complexities to figuring that out. And there's limits. If you go too low, the reason why they're up there is because you got to get away from the drag of the atmosphere. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's crowded up there. It's going to get more crowded, and I don't have a good answer for you. Apparently, there's enough space because they keep authorizing launches. So, yeah.
Yeah, you've got a great list you had a great list up of those commercial firms that are trying to make money, and of course, they want proprietary information, and there
Yep.
are IP problems involved with getting at those algorithms, to getting at the systems involved. Do you recommend people investing their time and effort with organizations where you can't get at that information, or would you rather have people work with open source programs where one can at least unpack some of those heuristics and find out what's actually going on in the systems?
I mean, I think it depends on your needs. If you want a black box, you can. You know, here's what I say about things like machine learning and black box. Machine learning has, I published a paper on machine learning 20 years ago, right? It's been around, algorithms change, all but it's basically, they're fitting algorithms to data, right? But the key thing about machine learning is, and that comes to my Venn diagram at the end, the key thing about machine learning is that if you don't give it good features, if you don't give it good predictors, it's not going to help you. And so that's what's the point of my last slide. It has to be a partnership with people that understand the problem, understand the data, and then, you know, pick your algorithm. You know, neural networks, support vector machines, boosted decision trees, you know, who cares? They all do the same, kind of the same thing with, you know, some do a little better than others. But so I think it really depends on your needs.
We're going to let you off the hook.
All right, thanks. Thanks, everybody.